The Untold Files.
October 18th, 1949. 6:14 in the morning. Harlem was still asleep. The street cleaners hadn't come through yet. The milk trucks were just starting their rounds on 7th Avenue, glass bottles clinking like tiny bells in the cold autumn air. The jazz clubs had closed 3 hours ago. The numbers runners were already awake, but barely, counting receipts in the back of barber shops and beauty parlors with one eye on the door. And on the second floor of a brown brick building at 143 West 117th Street, a woman was dying. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way the movies show it, with grand speeches and tearful goodbyes. She was dying the way poison works when it's done right, quietly, patiently, like a slow fire started in the walls of a house. By the time the smoke reached you, the foundation was already gone. Her name was Mabel Johnson, 53 years old, church on Sundays, never missed a Wednesday prayer meeting, a woman who had cooked 100 Sunday dinners for half the block, who kept her front door unlocked because she believed that a neighborhood that locks its doors forgets its own soul. And she was Bumpy Johnson's sister, the older sister, the one who had taken in a 14-year-old boy from Charleston, South Carolina, back in 1919, the one who had fed him, protected him, prayed for him, and quietly watched as that boy became the most powerful and most feared man in Harlem, the one who had never asked him for anything except that he come home safe. That morning, at 6:14 a.m., her neighbor, Mrs. Odessa Clark, 71 years old, who lived across the hall and had known Mabel for 22 years, heard her moaning through the wall. Not crying, not screaming, just a low, steady, terrible sound. The kind of sound that tells you something deep inside a person is being broken apart, piece by piece. Odessa knocked, then knocked harder, then ran downstairs to find someone who could help. By the time Dr. Robert Freeman arrived at 7:02 a.m., Mabel Johnson had been vomiting for 6 hours. Her lips were cracked and dry despite the cold sweat soaking through her nightgown. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling, and the muscles in her legs had seized up so tight she couldn't stand without screaming. Dr. Freeman took one look at her and knew this wasn't influenza. This wasn't food poisoning from a bad meal. The pattern of symptoms, the burning sensation in the throat and stomach, the metallic taste she kept describing, the rice water-like quality of what she'd expelled through the night, the blue-gray tinge beginning to form at the base of her fingernails, told a story that Dr. Freeman, who had served 2 years in the Army Medical Corps during World War II, recognized immediately. Someone had poisoned Mabel Johnson, and whoever had done it had used arsenic. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, this channel is where Harlem's buried history gets unearthed. We tell the untold stories of the men and women who lived, fought, and bled in the streets that most history books skip right over. If that's the kind of history that keeps you up at night, the real kind, hit that subscribe button right now and join this community. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Because this story has reached people from Harlem to Johannesburg to London to Lagos, and I want to know who's in the room. To understand what happened in those 6 days that Harlem would whisper about for the next 50 years, you first have to understand what Harlem was in 1949. The war was over. The boys had come home. But home for black men in Harlem didn't mean parades and prosperity. It meant coming back to the same overcrowded tenements, the same crooked landlords, the same police officers who treated 125th Street like an occupied territory. The GI Bill that built white suburbs and funded white education sent barely a trickle into black neighborhoods. The promises of the war, all that talk about democracy and freedom, had cashed out to exactly nothing north of 96th Street. But Harlem breathed. Harlem always breathed. By 1949, 7th Avenue, also called Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, was the spine of the community. On any given evening, you could hear bebop drifting out of Minton's Playhouse on 118th Street, where Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie had invented a new language for the soul. You could smell sugar from the bakeries on Lenox Avenue before 8 in the morning. You could see Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. himself walk through the neighborhood and watch 50 people stop whatever they were doing to greet him, because in Harlem, a man of God and a man of the people were the same person. It was a community that had been pushed, squeezed, policed, and bled, and somehow, every generation it produced something magnificent. And at the center of Harlem's underground economy, controlling the numbers racket, the illegal lottery that served as both Harlem's stock market and its social safety net, was a man named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy. By 1949, Bumpy was 44 years old. He'd been through Sing Sing. He'd survived Dutch Schultz, the Italian 5 families, 3 separate assassination attempts, and 2 federal investigations. He stood at medium height, wire-frame glasses perched on his nose, always dressed in a pressed suit and tie, always carrying a book. Marcus Aurelius, W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, whatever he was reading that week. People who didn't know him saw a mild-mannered, well-read businessman. People who did know him understood that the mildness was not the absence of fire. It was the mastery of it. He controlled the flow of tens of thousands of dollars through Harlem every single week. Betting slips passed through barbershops, laundromats, corner stores, churches, in a system so intricate and so trusted that ordinary people, working people, grandmothers and sanitation workers and school teachers all put their dimes and quarters into the numbers, because Bumpy Johnson always paid. Out. Always. But more important than the money was the protection. By 1949, Bumpy had negotiated a fragile tente with the Italian crime families, specifically through Frank Costello, who had recognized that trying to take Harlem by force was like trying to hold water in your fist. You couldn't own Harlem. You could only work with the man who did. That wall held as long as people believed in it. And that is precisely why, in the autumn of 1949, a man decided to go through it by poisoning the woman who had built Bumpy Johnson's foundation, his sister Mabel. His name in the streets was Red Monroe. His real name was Calvin Theodore Monroe, 31 years old, born in Baltimore, Maryland. He had come to New York in 1943, initially working as a numbers runner in the Bronx, then drifting into enforcement work, the kind of work where you were paid to make problems disappear without leaving fingerprints. By 1947, he was known in certain circles as a reliable contractor, not a loud man, not a theatrical man, the kind of man who did the work and collected the envelope and moved on to the next job with no more emotion than a plumber fixing a pipe. He was not the architect of what happened to Mabel Johnson. He was the instrument. The architect was a man named Victor Salais, a Bronx-based fence and loan shark with ties to the Lucchese family, who had spent 3 years quietly undercutting Bumpy's operation. Sales wasn't trying to take Harlem directly. He was trying to create instability. His theory was simple and, in its own cold-blooded way, elegant. If you can't kill the man, kill the myth. The myth of Bumpy Johnson rested on one foundation, that those under his protection were safe. A slow poison left no evidence. A woman dying of what the NIPD would write off as gastric illness generated no investigation, no headlines, no dramatic confrontation. The contract was arranged in November of 1948, almost a full year before execution. Monroe took the job for $3,000, half up front. half on confirmation of death. He spent 3 months studying Mabel Johnson's routine. He knew which diner she ate at. He knew which pew she sat in at Abyssinian Baptist. He knew that every Tuesday and Thursday evening, between 5:30 and 6:15, Mabel would stop at May's Kitchen on 106th Street and Lenox Avenue and order the same thing: a bowl of oxtail soup, a piece of cornbread, and a cup of chamomile tea. Every single Tuesday and Thursday. The arsenic compound Monroe used was obtained through a chemistry contact in Newark, a white powder, odorless, tasteless in small doses, designed to accumulate in the body over time. 1 dose made a person ill. A second dose, 3 or 4 days later, began shutting organs down. It was the kind of poison favored by people who wanted death to look like illness. On the evening of Tuesday, October 17, 1949, at 5:47 p.m., Monroe entered May's Kitchen. He sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and waited. Mabel arrived at 5:52 p.m., just as she always did. Monroe had already bribed the kitchen boy, a 19-year-old named Cecil, with $7 and a story about a prank. Cecil added the powder to the oxtail soup. Mabel Johnson ate her meal, drank her tea, paid her bill, and walked home. By 11:30 that night, the burning had started. By 3:00 in the morning, she couldn't keep water down. By 6:14 a.m., her neighbor heard her moaning through the wall. Here is what history books will never tell you about Harlem in 1949. The police were not the intelligence service of that community. They never had been. The real intelligence service, the network that tracked who came, who went, who stayed too long in one place, who asked too many questions, was made up of the people the police never thought to look at. Shoeshine boys, parking attendants, corner newspaper sellers, the woman who cleaned the office building and saw who came and went at unusual hours, the old man who sat in a folding chair outside his building every afternoon and watched the street, as though watching the street were his life's work, because, for him, it was. Bumpy Johnson had spent 20 years cultivating that network, not because he was paranoid, but because he understood something fundamental about power in a community like Harlem. Information was the truest currency. His lieutenant, Illinois Gordon, lean, quiet, 52 years old, gray at the temples, a man who moved through Harlem like smoke, ran the network day to day. Within 18 hours of Mabel falling ill, Illinois had already started pulling threads, not because Bumpy had asked him to, because Illinois knew that look on Bumpy's face. He went to May's Kitchen. He sent a woman named Dolores, who looked like exactly what she was, a middle-aged seamstress getting supper. She noticed the kitchen boy, Cecil, was nervous, the kind of nervous that a 19-year-old wears like a suit 2 sizes too small. Illinois went to Cecil. He didn't threaten. He simply sat across from him and explained that whatever Cecil had done, his cooperation now was the only thing standing between him and something considerably worse. Cecil broke in 11 minutes. He described the man at the counter, the coffee, the $7, the small folded paper with the white powder. Then Illinois found Mr. Hiram Truesdale, a 70-year-old retired postal worker who had sat in a folding chair outside his building on 116th Street every afternoon for 12 years. Mr. Truesdale had seen the man in the green wool coat enter May's Kitchen. He described him precisely: medium height, reddish-brown complexion, scar along the left jaw. By noon on October 19th, less than 36 hours after Mabel had first fallen ill, Illinois Gordon had a name. The name led to a face. The face led to a rooming house on 148th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. Illinois went back to Bumpy. He laid out what he knew like cards on a table: the kitchen boy, the description, the address, the name, and one more thread he'd pulled in the Bronx, the name Sally's. The man behind the man, Bumpy sat with it for a long moment. He was at Mabel's bedside. He listened to everything. Then he looked out the window at the October sky over Harlem. He said one sentence, "Bring me the bottle." That sentence sent 3 men in 3 different directions before another word was spoken. Marcus Cole, Bumpy's most capable enforcer, a quiet Mississippian in his early 40s, who had once been a deacon before Harlem had other plans for him, drove to Newark within the hour. He came back before midnight with confirmation of what had been purchased, and one critical additional detail. Monroe had purchased 2 doses. 2. The poison in Mabel's soup was not intended to kill immediately. It was the first strike. A second dose was to follow on Sunday, when Monroe would wait for Mabel to recover enough to return to her routine and finish the job. This changed the timeline, made the urgency visceral and immediate. Willie Lee, a 135th Street native with the gift of walking into any room in Harlem and seeming like he'd always been there, went to the rooming house on 148th and Amsterdam. He moved in across the hall, paid 3 weeks' rent in cash, and for 2 days mapped every movement Monroe made. Monroe's surveillance habits were professional. Twice daily perimeter walks, short-coded phone calls from a corner payphone on 149th Street. But Willie Lee was patient, and patient men outlast professional ones. Willie Lee identified the relay man on the Bronx end of those payphone calls. By the evening of October 21st, 4 days after Mabel was poisoned, Bumpy had the full chain, every name, every location. And one more thing. Dr. Vernon Hayes had quietly obtained the same arsenic compound, same formulation, same batch concentration, through discreet medical supply channels, the same poison, bottled, ready, enough to make a man violently, persistently, unforgettably ill, not enough to kill him. That distinction was deliberate. Bumpy had a philosophy about punishment refined over 30 years of operating in a world where the courts offered his community nothing. He had said it once to Illinois Gordon, years ago, in a sentence Illinois had never forgotten. The grave is a mercy. I prefer justice. Death was the thing a frightened man chose when he couldn't think of anything worse. But living with the consequence, waking up every morning in a body that bore the permanent mark of your own wickedness, that was the truest sentence. On the morning of October 22nd, Bumpy sent Monroe a message through the relay system. It came wrapped in the language of a business opportunity, a meeting, neutral ground, good money on the table, no hard feelings. Everybody walks away clean. Monroe's handler in the Bronx told him to take the meeting. He shouldn't have. Pause right here for 1 second, because I need you to sit with something before we go into the next room, before we walk into what happened on the night of October 22nd. I want you to ask yourself, if the law won't protect your family, if the police won't come, if the courts won't listen, what does justice look like? Drop your answer in the comments right now. This channel exists to ask the questions that history leaves unasked. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what happens next is the kind of history that changes how you see everything that came before it. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to know whose eyes are on this story tonight. October 22nd, 1949, 9:17 p.m. The meeting place was a back room at a small social club on 141st Street and Lenox Avenue, a place called the Ebony Room, which operated during the day as a barbershop and in the evenings as a private members' club for the kind of men who preferred their conversations unreported. The room was narrow and low-ceilinged, with 4 chairs, a round wooden table, a single overhead lamp casting amber light across everything, and walls covered in photographs of jazz musicians and boxing champions, Louis Armstrong, Sugar Ray Robinson, Coleman Hawkins, watching from their frames, like a jury of legends. Red Monroe arrived at 9:17 p.m., 5 minutes early. Green wool coat, back to the wall, as instinct demanded, He looked around the room once, satisfied himself that no one else was present, and waited. At 9:22 p.m., Bumpy Johnson walked in, alone. No Marcus Cole, no Willie Lee, no Illinois Gordon, just Bumpy in a charcoal gray suit and white shirt, glasses on, book tucked under his left arm, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which he had been carrying that week. He sat down across from Monroe without drama. He set the book on the table. He looked at Monroe with the calm, level, entirely undisturbed gaze that every man who had ever sat across from Bumpy Johnson described in identical terms, the look of a man who had already seen every possible version of this conversation and was simply waiting for reality to catch up with what he already knew. Monroe began to speak. Bumpy let him speak for about 45 seconds, the professional patter, the distance establishing pleasantries, and then raised one hand, very gently, in a small stopping gesture. Monroe stopped. Bumpy placed his hands flat on the table. "How's your appetite?" Monroe didn't answer. Something in the question reached down through all his professional composure and touched something cold and instinctive at the base of his spine. The door opened. Marcus Cole came in, carrying a small wooden tray. On the tray, one cup. Chamomile tea, steam rising thin and delicate in the amber light, and beside the cup, placed with deliberate, almost ceremonial precision, a small glass vial. Empty, with a handwritten label that Monroe recognized immediately. The batch number he had memorized months ago in Newark. The same batch, the same compound. Monroe's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Bumpy watched this reaction with no more visible emotion than a man watching weather pass across a window. "My sister," he said, in a voice so quiet the room had to lean in to hear it, "spent 3 days unable to lift a cup. Can't keep food in her stomach. Hands she used to cook for half this neighborhood, shaking like leaves. And she doesn't know why. She thinks it was bad food. She thinks God was testing her." He paused. "She's wrong about the last part." Monroe started to speak. The hand went up again. "I spent 20 years building something in this community," Bumpy said. "The one thing I promised the people in this neighborhood, the numbers men, the shopkeepers, the mothers, the grandmothers, was that anybody connected to me was safe. Not rich, not powerful, safe. You understand what it costs to build that reputation. You understand what happens to the entire architecture of this community if a man can poison Bumpy Johnson's sister and walk away clean?" Monroe was very still now. Bumpy looked at the cup of tea. "You're going to drink that?" Monroe shook his head, very slightly. "Calvin," Bumpy said, and it was the use of his real name, his birth name, that seemed to reach Monroe more than anything else. "I know where you sleep. I know what you ate for breakfast this morning. I know the phone call you made at 2:47 this afternoon and who was on the other end. I know your mother lives on Maryland Avenue in Baltimore, and I know she goes to Greater Grace Temple every Sunday morning, and I know she doesn't know what her son does for money." A silence stretched between them, like a wire pulled taut. "You have one choice available to you tonight. You drink that tea, you tell me everything about Silas, every name, every location, every arrangement, every plan, and then you leave this room on your own 2 feet. In roughly 3 to 5 days, you will wish you hadn't. You will be very unwell. You will understand in your body what my sister understands in hers, and then you will recover. Slowly, but you will recover." He let that settle. "Or," Bumpy said, and this was the only moment in the entire conversation where something changed in his eyes. Not anger, exactly, its older and more dignified ancestor, certainty. You don't drink the tea, and I find other ways to make sure you understand the lesson. Red Monroe looked at the cup for a very long time. The steam kept rising, thin and patient and white in the amber light. At 9:41 p.m., Monroe picked up the cup. He talked for 47 minutes after that. Every name, every location. Salisa's warehouse in the Bronx, the relay man, the Lucchese connection, the plan for the second dose, the timeline, the money, everything. Bumpy listened. Illinois Gordon, who had entered quietly after Monroe began talking, wrote it all down. At 10:28 p.m., Monroe stood up. He buttoned his coat. He walked to the door. Bumpy said, without looking up, "Tell Salise I said hello." Monroe stopped, turned, looked at Bumpy Johnson for the last time. Then he walked out into the Harlem night. By the morning of October 23rd, Harlem knew, not through newspapers, not through a press release or a police report or any official channel. Harlem knew the way Harlem always knew the things that mattered, through the barber shops, through the beauty parlors, through the corner conversations, through the look on people's faces when they passed each other on 125th Street and exchanged a single significant glance that contained a complete paragraph. Bumpy Johnson had been touched. Not him personally, but his family, which in Harlem's moral geography was the same thing and perhaps worse, and rather than retaliating with blood, which everybody had expected, which everybody had braced for, he had done something that no one had expected. He had returned the poison, precisely, measuredly, in the same cup, at the same temperature, with the same exact compound, not more, not less. The mirror sentence. A 60-year-old retired carpenter named James Whitfield, who had watched Harlem's underground economy operate across 3 decades, told the story this way to his grandchildren years later. Bumpy didn't just get even. He got exact. And exact is something different. Exact means the punishment fit the crime like a glove. You can argue with proportional. You cannot argue with exact. At Abyssinian Baptist Church that Sunday, October 23, 1949, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. did not speak Bumpy Johnson's name from the pulpit. He didn't have to. When he chose the scripture for that morning's sermon, Galatians 6:7, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap," the congregation knew exactly what he meant. And when he paused after reading it and looked out over his people with that preacher's silence that carries more weight than noise, there was not one person in that building who wasn't thinking about a woman on 117th Street who had survived a poison she hadn't known she swallowed, and a man in a green wool coat who was, at that very moment, learning what that survival had felt like. The lesson had been delivered on multiple frequencies at once. To Red Monroe, your tools can be turned. To Victor Sayes, your chain was found, your plan was known, your contractor is now your liability. To every operator in those corridors between law and power, touching Bumpy Johnson's family was not a transaction, it was a declaration, and declarations required responses that were public, legible, and impossible to misread. To Harlem itself, the wall held. On October 23rd, Bumpy visited his sister. He brought yellow chrysanthemums, her favorite, flowers she had always associated with mornings because they opened toward the sun. He sat with her for 2 hours. He read to her from Meditations, not the war sections, not the endurance passages, but the gentler ones, about how a man conducts himself in a world that tests him constantly. Mabel, still weak, still trembling, reached out from her bed and put her hand over his. She said, "You didn't have to." He said, "Mabel, you took me in when I was 14 years old and had nothing. When Mama and Daddy couldn't keep me safe, they put me on a train, and you met me at Penn Station with a coat, because you knew the Charleston boy wouldn't be dressed for a New York autumn. You took me in. You fed me. You prayed for me every night for 50 years. I am everything I am because of the foundation you laid." He paused. So yes, I did have to. Red Monroe survived. He He was hospitalized at Harlem Hospital on October 26, 1949, 3 days after the meeting in the Ebony Room, presenting with what was logged by the attending physician as severe acute gastrointestinal distress of unknown origin. The symptoms that Dr. Freeman had noted in Mabel Johnson's chart were present in Monroe's admissions paperwork almost word for word. The physicians who treated him were unable to determine a definitive cause. He was discharged on November 2nd, 1949. He left New York City within the week and never returned. Calvin Theodore Monroe retired from contract work entirely. He returned to Baltimore. He worked, for a time, as a mechanic. He is believed to have died in the late 1970s, the precise date unconfirmed, the death unremarkable in every respect, except that it occurred in a city he had fled to, and in a profession as far from his former trade as geography could manage. Victor Siles did not fare as well. Within 60 days of that meeting in the Ebony Room, the information Monroe had provided to Illinois Gordon was fully deployed. Not violently, not dramatically. The relay man found his employment in 2 Bronx area policy operations terminated without explanation. His landlord declined to renew his lease. His Lucchese contact stopped returning messages. Salis discovered, over the winter of 1949 into 1950, that the invisible infrastructure he had spent 3 years building in Upper Manhattan was quietly, systematically, and entirely without a single shot fired, dismantled, every wire cut, every connection severed. By spring of 1950, Salis had abandoned his Manhattan ambitions entirely. He had lost 3 years of investment, multiple business relationships, and, perhaps most expensive of all, his reputation for being a man who planned carefully and executed cleanly. Because the plan had failed, and in that world, failure of that magnitude against that man did not merely cost you the job. It cost you everything the job was supposed to buy. Mabel Johnson recovered, fully. Physically, over the course of 3 months. The tremor subsided by December, her appetite returned by Thanksgiving, and when it did, the first thing she made was Sunday dinner for the block, served from her kitchen window on West 117th Street to a line of neighbors that stretched halfway down the block. She lived to be 79 years old. She died in 1975, 26 years after the October night, when someone tried to take her quietly and without consequence. She died in the same apartment where she had taken in her brother as a boy, where she had built a life out of faith and food and the radical, defiant act of keeping her door open to the community. At her funeral, Bumpy having died 7 years earlier at Wells Restaurant in 1968, 500 people attended. The overflow lined the sidewalk outside Abyssinian Baptist. Several people who had known her in those final years said that she rarely spoke about October 1949. When she did, she spoke of it not as a story of violence or revenge, but as a story about a brother, about what it meant to be truly known by someone who would not let your suffering go unacknowledged. He saw me. She told a community journalist in 1971 in the only published interview she ever gave. In that world where black women were invisible to everybody with power, the law, the courts, the newspapers, my brother saw me, and he made sure that the people who thought I was invisible understood their mistake. She paused. That's not just protection. That's love. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of what justice looked like on streets that the law abandoned, then subscribe right now, because we have more stories like this one, and each one runs deeper than the last. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? And tell me this, what do you think was Bumpy Johnson's greatest weapon? The network? The philosophy? Or something else entirely? The conversation in the comments is part of the history. Don't miss it.